Hi
Hi,
there.
Pat.
How are
Hello.
you doing?
Not too bad. You?
Fine.
Good, good. Here we are.
I've lost my. Oh, here we are.
Hello, hello, Peter. You okay?
Hi, how are you?
Hi there. How are you doing?
Very good. Thanks, Ben. Good.
Okay. Well, thanks, guys, for wanting to talk about episode Emily. It's very much appreciated. So what we're going to do is, for those watching along and for myself, we're just going to watch the episode on mute just to guide the conversation a little bit. So if everybody just wants to take a moment or so to pause on the opening shot of the episode, is the Brian Clemens and Albert Fennell presents title card. We'll just pause on that, then I'll do a countdown from five, and then we'll start the proceedings.
I don't see anything. I only see you.
I should
And
have explained,
I,
Pat, Peter, that it's only for those that have a copy of it in their own homes because I can't show due
Oh,
to
okay.
copyright issues. Then
okay.
has an extremely
We'll
high
we'll
copyright
shut up
level.
until you
So
ask us a
um,
question. Right.
yeah, so that's just obviously because you guys have reviewed the episode beforehand, so that's as long as it's fresh in the mind. The majority of our conversation will be general stuff anyway, I'm sure. So I'm just going to count off for five, and we'll press play. So five, four, three, two, one, and play. The first question I have is for you, Pat. There's a title card that says presents the new Avengers in Canada. Was that a contractual thing that had to sort of kind of highlight Canada?
Well, we obviously wanted to let people know where they were, and I can't remember whether it was a big contractual fight or not. The whole origin of the series was, is pretty fraught. But maybe what I should do is give you a bit of a perspective of how the Avengers came about. And it was actually created by a Canadian called Sidney Newman. And Sidney Newman worked for the National Film Board during the Second World War. And after the war, television was starting to happen. And he was sent by the film board to NBC, and he did a year with NBC in the States. And so he got a real education in television. When he came back to Canada, he was very soon snapped up by the CBC and given a senior position there. And he was doing all kinds of outside broadcasts and this, that, and the other, but he really wanted to do drama. And he eventually bludgeoned them into making him head of drama. And he started things like General Motors Theatre, which was a great success. But he was attracting interest in Britain. And he went over to Britain in the 50s, and he's really attributed with really changing British drama. He first of all joined ITV, the commercial stations, and invented a series called Armchair Theatre that was very successful. And it was there that he had the idea for the Avengers. He was then headhunted by the BBC and ended up as head of drama at the BBC, where he created the Wednesday play, which was an equivalent of armchair theatre. And he was also the guy who invented Doctor Who. So he was a very successful man who made a huge impact on British television. He came back to Canada in the 60s, late 60s, and he was he was working first of all for our regulatory commission, the CRTC. Then he did a bit of work for CTV, the commercial station, but he was then appointed the head of the National Film Board, where he'd started out. And alas, I think his term there was not deemed a success. The problem was that he was unilingual and the film board was French English. And so the French people just dismissed him as a sort of mere television man and not really anyone they wanted to deal with. They had a way of making their own feature films. The Brits, the English Canadians sort of dismissed him, and he never was able to really find a platform on the CBC for film board's work. And so without an audience, the film board, I think, even since that time, has struggled to find a real reason for its existence. So Sidney Newman was the guy who started the idea of the Avengers, and I think it started more as a sort of serious series, and then when Albert Fennell and Brian Clements got into it, they started to introduce more sort of wit and humor into it. And I think that's probably what you see in Emily, that there's a little bit of tongue in cheek in this episode. And the origins of the series were that the Avengers was a great success. It was one of the few British series that got onto US television, but it eventually sort of finished. But it was a great hit in France, and there was a rather roguish producer called Rodolphe Roffi, who decided that he was making commercials at the time, and he wanted to get Linda Thorson, who was the third of the famous ladies playing Emma Peel. There was Dinah Rigg, there was Honor Blackman, and she was a third one. She was a Canadian, actually. And so she was asked to do a commercial for Laurent Perrier champagne, and they decided to bring in Patrick Macnee, and so the two of them did it, and the commercial was a big success. And Roffi had the idea of why shouldn't he revive the franchise as the New Avengers? So he did that, and he got the British aboard, I think, and then so he did a first series, and then was having trouble. I'll explain why. He was having trouble finding money for the second series. In fact, what he'd done is he massively overspent on the first series. Anyway, we were enticed in, and the deal was that we would have the North American rights. So we sold CTV, and we found a home again on CBS. And we also insisted if we were bringing this money, we would get to produce 4 of the second series, the last 4 in the series, of which Emily is one. And all was proceeding. And then Patrick Macnee got very annoyed because he said he hadn't been paid. And what we got in touch with Roffi, and what we discovered is that Roffi had been paying Patrick's agent, but not sending the actual fee to Patrick. So we had to step in and solve that problem. And what we discovered then was we were approached by Pinewood Studios, Rank Laboratories, TF1 in France, and ITV in Britain, all saying, when do we get our share of the CBS monies? And we say, well, you don't, because we own those rights. And what Roffi had done was sell the rights to all 4 or 5 of us. And so we all had to take a small share. The impact on us, Nielsen Ferns, as we then were, was that our parent company, Torstar, the largest newspaper in Canada, seized the shares that Dick Nielsen and I had. So we went from being partners to being employees, so they could write off all of these losses. And that was really the beginning of the end of our association with Torstar. So very soon we were back on the street as humble independent producers. So I don't have a great affection for the business around this deal, but neither Dick Nielsen nor myself were really responsible because Torstar, our masters, had appointed a rather inexperienced lawyer to do all the due diligence, and their diligence was not deep enough to penetrate the fraud that Ruffy was had subjected us to. He was arrested in France, but as happens often in France, things happened and he never went to prison. So it was a sad story, almost as complicated as some of the plots of the new Avengers.
Mm.
Anyway, but in answer to your question, yeah, we wanted to call it that in Canada because in Canada, we as independent producers were really struggling to find an existence. Until that time, the only real dramas on Canadian television were produced in-house by the CBC or Radio Canada, its French equivalent. The big commercial network, CTV, bought all its drama from the United States. And so it was pretty slim pickings. In fact, a lot of the independent producers, what they produced was fillers to go between the programs for the CBC, and that was not what we wanted to do. So Dick Nielsen and I had this company that was one of the first independent production companies. We had 4 years on our own before we were acquired by Torstar, and then we spent 5 years with them, and then we're back on our own again. And our first drama was a series called The Newcomers, Les Arrivants, which was shot in French and English. It was financed essentially by Imperial Oil, which is Esso, and they wanted, as part of their 100th anniversary, to donate a series to Canada about the whole immigrant experience. And so we produced 7 dramas. And I think, Peter, you did some work on one of them, did you not?
I did. The Scottish one.
The Scottish one, written by Timothy Finlay, one of our great writers. And so it was, this was
Was that fun to do, the newcomers?
Well, I don't know if it was fun. It was certainly revolutionary. Dick and I felt that the kind of people that were writing scripts on Canadian television were not that good. And so we went to hire some of our best writers. They included Timothy Finlay, the novelist, Alice Munro, the Nobel Prize winning writer of short stories. We had Al Purdy, who was a poet, George Riga, who was a playwright, with Claude Guy Fournier, who was a well-known writer in Quebec. So we found the best writers, and then we started the series, and we began with a prologue about the First Nations in Canada, and before contact from the colonizers. And so the first drama I ever produced was in the Gitxsan language, and it was shot in northern British Columbia, far from wherever. And as I kind of said, that I was someone who'd never been to film school or had any experience. I joined the CBC to do current affairs. So I was really someone who started an independent as in the officer class, but I'd never been through basic training. Then when the first drama set I stepped on was actually one doing the Newcomers. I had never been on a drama set before. So I said it was rather like being transferred to the Navy my first appointment was as captain of the ship, and I'd never been to sea. So it was rather tricky time, but we did that one. And then the next couple, we did the French, and then we did the Scottish, which Peter, no, we did the Irish, and then we did the Scottish the next season. Anyway, we basically the first show that I actually produced as drama in English got an Emmy nomination. So I kind of felt that it was a fast study, but I did all right. So I survived, and I'm still, barely alive today. So here we are.
Hmm.
So yes, the newcomers was it was a successful series, and involved a lot of the major actors in Canada, and as I say, we had really good writers. I mean, I just wish we could have persuaded Alice Munro to continue writing screenplays, because her dialogue was probably the best dialogue I've ever read for the screen. Anyway, so we were when we were acquired by Torstar, that they said we couldn't produce anything unless we had all the money in place, but they did give us some development money and funds to travel. So I was able to build up the co-production side of the business, and that's out of which came these co-productions, mainly at the beginning with Britain.
Mhm.
And that's how we sort of got our start. We didn't specialize. We did documentaries, we did drama, we did music programs, we did whatever would keep the wolf from the door. So it was struggling times.
Hmm.
But yeah.
Also, I just wanted to ask Peter briefly. There's lots of good second unit stuff in this episode. Lots of card chasers, etc. A lovely sequence with of water skiing on the lake, and then go into an action sequence. Peter, did you enjoy doing second unit? Because of course you had directed actual TV programs by this point. Was second unit interesting?
I was glad to be working. I was pleased that Pat invited me in. I think, honestly, they were having some problems with that episode, with the scheduling of it. They were running behind. So I wasn't brought in at the beginning. I was brought in midway through to try and clean up things, and did what I could to. In the end, I remember, even though I was called second unit director and my unit was second unit, the schedule was kind of so discombobulated at that point that I was frequently shooting scenes with McNee and Lumley and the other lead. So that's kind of what happened. I mean, to be honest, that show is 50 years old. And so if we were back in the era when we were shooting that show and reminiscing about shows that were then 50 years old, we would have been talking about the silent era and not Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton, but kind of B silent films of 1925. So, has it aged well? I don't know. I see Pat reacting the same way. I mean, to be honest, let me tell you something. I look on it as a typical of that passion in the 60s and 70s for films, series, the like, about the Cold War. you know, it was all about the threat of Russia and the threat of the Soviet Union. And so it was, of course, leading the pack was James Bond. Then there was the Mad Helm series. There was the Man from U.N.C.L.E. There was Mission Impossible. And there was the Avengers. You know, now that we know what absolute horrible craziness was going on with the KGB and the Stasi and the Polish Secret Service, the secret police in that era, I find it rather odd to be looking at this sort of jovial sort of carrying on about the Cold War and about spying. The only spy film of that era that really had any reality was the film with Richard Burton, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. But the rest of them, I mean, it's odd for me to look at them today. And, you know, I've become quite a student of that era. I recently wrote a book about the era of, it's clear, it's right here. There we go. It's called A Place 10 Years That Shook the World. It's about that whole revolutionary era. And when you consider what was going on then in terms of China and Russia, the Cold War, and America, and Latin America, everywhere, Quebec, Ireland, etc. It is rather odd for me to see this kind of jovial, joking sort of attitudes in that film, in that series. What do you think?
Yeah, Peter, it's sort of, I found it had a quality of sort of innocence that was kind of amusing to see. But I actually thought the second unit stuff for its time looked extremely good, that there were a lot of interesting cars and they skidded around and chased each other through Toronto and or the countryside outside of Toronto. But yeah, looking at it 50 years on, it's somewhat naive, but it was better than any of the other drama that was going on at the time. You know that the CBC certainly wasn't producing anything that anything memorable at that time. And as I say, CTV was buying all its stuff from the States, so
Yeah.
that was the competition. And yeah, it's of course it was in that era, I suppose, that eventually, you know, Steve McQueen and Bullet happened, and we then started to realize what a car chase really could be. Yeah.
You know,
Anyway.
one thing that I noticed, because I watched some of the other ones you provided me with, Philip. First of all, the craziness of all those Dutch tilts. Everybody, now, I did not shoot them, but on the other episodes, every shot, the horizon's all askew in this supposedly hip manner. I suppose, you know, that comes from, you know, Batman and other kind of pop art influenced television shows of that era. But I got it, it's a different style. The other thing I noticed is that the writers could not really find anything for the two sidekicks to do. They just stand around, occasionally giving a bit of exposition or making sort of unnecessary comments about, oh, here we are in Toronto, or things like that. But, you know, it's not an uncommon problem. I believe I read on, because in research for this hour of podcasting, I looked up the Wikipedia entry on the New Avengers, and they mentioned that it was, I believe they said, one of the networks thought that they needed some young blood to go along with Patrick Macnee, and also that there was a feeling he was 55, which to my way of thinking is young, but they thought that was old. So they thought he wouldn't be able to manage the more physical things. But, you know, I had the same thing. I have just did, as I think you know, Philip, not just, but I have done a series called Angry Planet. We did 49 episodes, shot it all over the world. Did the first 39 with one host. When a new network came on for the last 10, they had the same bright idea. Oh, this host is, what was he then, 50 or 49 or something. We gotta get someone else to bring in the young audience. So we had to cast around. We brought in a young woman who was sort of a podcasting influencer to co-host with him, and the same thing happened. Fortunately, my sort of executive producers on the show convinced the network that this was a crazy idea, and we actually did drop her after the first episode because it was impossible to figure out what to do with her, just as I feel in the episodes I've seen, they could never figure out really what to do with Joanna Lumley and Gareth. So
Yeah, I think to be fair, that Lumley and Gareth Hunt, they sort of ran and they fought and they did the stunts, and Patrick just sort of grazed his way through the production very calmly. But no, I mean, what was interesting was seeing, you know, how the original series, which I think was much better actually, did have a kind of style to it. I mean, Pierre Cardin did all the costumes for Honor Blackman and Dinah Rigg and Linda Thorson, and certainly I think with the new Avengers, they worked diligently to find the right person, and Joanna Lumley, though she may not have had, you know, memorable lines, and that was a presence, and she continues on even today, hosting documentary travel series just on the Silk Road, I think. And yeah, of course, Patrick, you know, was a major presence. I actually worked a lot with his son, Rupert Macnee. Rupert, at that period, was working, I think, for City TV in Toronto, and we reconnected later in life when he was living down where his father was in, I think, Rancho Mirage or whatever it's called, near Palm Springs. And we developed a series on Charles Darwin together that eventually I produced with the Australians and the Germans and the French, and it was quite successful. So, but no, I mean, co-production was the way of the world. That we were one of the pioneers in doing a lot of co-production with Britain and subsequently with France and Germany, and a lot of my contemporaries, they looked south to the United States and ended up concluding they had to move south. So there's a huge Canadian diaspora in Los Angeles, and you know, our struggle was always how can we compete with the onslaught of American television. These were programs that covered their costs in the United States, so they were basically dumped in markets all around the world, and but they were of high production value, and our struggle as independents was to find our own voice. And that was the one good thing that came out of our association with Torstar, is I was able to spend half my time leading the charge. Sorry, someone's using my printer. Oh, yes. Anyway, and they oh, where was I? Where was I? Yes. Oh, I've sort of lost my train of thought. That's what a printing
That's okay.
error does. Anyway,
What I was going to ask, Pat, so it sounds like when they wanted to get a co-production together and they turned their view to Canada, you were kind of the obvious choice, perhaps the only choice in that time.
well, we were probably the main choice, in that in those days, as I said, a lot of independent producers were looking to the States. And I thought that I should work with Britain. I was a Canadian who grew up in Britain, but I spoke the language, and I knew just how pompous and snotty a lot of BBC executives were. And so I could then flash my Cambridge University card, and they'd start to take me a little more seriously. So yeah, the having the money with Torstar meant that I could, work half my life on behalf of the Independent Producers Association. And so we were always lobbying in Ottawa to get the CBC, first of all, to recognize they had to work with independents. And then when they finally agreed but didn't provide any money, we had to find ways of doing this. And eventually our campaigning led to the launch of what was called the Broadcast Fund of Telefilm Canada. And that enabled us to have some support for television production. Until that time, the only real subsidies were for feature film production. That in French Canada, this worked fairly well. They had their own directors, their own audience, and their own performers, and created their own stars. We were always in that compromise situation that you're trying to compete with Hollywood with their stars and their production values, etc. But we believed that television was the way to reach an audience, and it proved to be the case. So what was, when we started, virtually no industry. By the time, last year, it's a $12 billion industry employing, 250,000 people. And while some of that work is servicing Hollywood, a lot of it is also Canadian originated production and co-productions with countries all over the world. So co-production is something that it was necessary in Canada. People often said, well, that's compromise and whatever. And I said, no, if we're going to tell our own stories, we've got to find partners who put up significant chunks of money. And what I found through my career is whenever you got an American network involved, they basically, he who pays the piper calls the tune. And so very difficult to maintain oneself. I mean, I remember once I was developing a drama about Sir Harry Oakes, who was the richest man in the world, and he was, murdered in a controversial circumstance during the Second World War. And our film, which we're going to co-produce with the British, was called The Murder of Sir Harry Oakes. But the Americans came in. They were developing a similar story, but they had a writer's strike, and so that the producer on the American side summoned me to a meeting in Paris, because I was at MIP TV and he was striding around in France. And he kind of said, well, we think because there's a writer's strike, we could merge our interests. And I said, well, you know, we've got this script, and he said, well, we've got our script, and there was sort of deadlock there. And he said, well, if you go your own way, I will deny you the United States. So I rather pompously replied, well, I'll deny you the rest of the world. And we both glared at each other for about 5 seconds, and then we both burst out laughing. And we decided to get into business together. It made sense, but the resulting production went from being this taut political drama to being a sort of romance called Passion and Paradise. But we were kind of lorded around Hollywood as we were going to have the first mini series on the air after the writers' strike. And so we were treated like real royalty. But on the night that it premiered, CBS decided to run a movie called Swimsuit, and we came second in the ratings. And if you're not number one, you're suddenly hounded around. So anyway, but the Passion in Paradise did extremely well on CTV. So we established that as one of we did drama miniseries for a lot for CBC and CTV and global, and that was, you know, our specialty, I suppose.
One thing that I was interested in is there's 7 episodes that are not UK based, three French ones, and then 4 Canadian. And all the Canadian ones are directed by Canadian directors, and I assume it was part of the co-production that was the case. But one of the French ones was not directed; it was directed by an Englishman. So I assume you had a tighter concept if it had to be Canadians behind the camera.
Well, the financing depends upon you. In those days, it was tax shelters. And if you did not have the Canadian rules where you needed a Canadian, the key points were director and writer, and you had to have a Canadian in one of them. And obviously, some of these scripts were being written by Brian Clements and company, and so we had to have the director if we were able to bring the money. We did.
Mhm.
So yes, it was. Those are the compromises of co-production. But if that hadn't happened, then you'd find that everything was being directed by the Brits or the Americans, and we wanted to give people like Peter a chance, because he needs to have real films to do and not just smaller things.
And Peter, do you remember working with the director Don Thompson?
Yes, I remember there was one day, which was the climax of our shoot, when they put both units together. And it's that scene, sort of a shootout with cars in a valley. I don't know who Don Thompson is, to be honest. I've looked him up. I don't know if Pat remembers him, but he did not have much more of a career that I know of shooting drama in Canada. Maybe he shot some news or docs or something. But perhaps Pat will tell us. But just in answer to your question about France, the answer to that is probably either the French rules were not as crisp as the Canadian rules were, or else, also possible, maybe the French producer or the British producers snuck around the rules somehow and got a British director shooting in France. But
yeah, what happened is once Britain had joined the common market, there were rules that any one member of the common market, so a Brit could be a Frenchman, etc. I did one series where it was majority Canadian because we spent a few dollars more in Canada. but the French managed to count the British expenditure and their own and used a different exchange rate. So they said it was majority French. And the British just said, well, we deem this educational programming, even though it was a kind of adventure series. And so it qualifies as British. So we had a production that all three countries claimed was their nationality. But anyway, these things happen. No, about Don Thompson, he was a good friend of Jim Hanley, who we'd hired and was on the thing, but Jim had no real drama experience either. And it was Thompson didn't shoot the next series, the next program. I think Claude Fournier was brought in, and I'd worked with Claude before, so it's yeah, it was. We didn't have depth in the industry at that time, and now, of course, you got a lot of very seasoned professionals that could handle these things. But this was pioneering days, and so I suppose in one sense it was a bit like the Wild West, and certain gun shooters came into town, and some survived and some did not.
Back in those days, I did something which was common, I think, which was because there was so many co-productions. My father was British, so I qualified to apply for although I was born in Canada, qualified to apply for a British passport, which I got. And a lot of times it was thought that I might be able to use it as others did, and indeed as Brits did, who could get a Canadian passport, to qualify for the other half of the co-production treaty. And in fact, I only ever really once used it. I made a version of Treasure Island with someone, I don't know if you remember, Pat, but Harry Allen Towers was
yes, indeed, yes.
a wonderful character who produced this film along with Peter Cronenberg, you might also remember. And we shot it in the Isle of Man. And it was, as they always are, highly complicated. And in the end, they did somehow need to use me as British content because the crew was almost entirely Quebecois. And so
Yeah, there was a strange tax shelter in the Isle of Man. I remember we did one film there, and but no, you're right that one of the challenges of co-production is trying to get all the moving parts to work together, and they have to come from different countries and different where the money comes from. So it's a challenge.
And Pat, you mentioned that Don Thompson wasn't the most suited to this kind of show, but that Claude and Fournier and Richard Gilbert, were they more the suited to
Yeah,
this?
I'd worked with Claude on The Newcomers, so we knew him. And Richard Gilbert, he's gone on to have a decent career. So I think there was a bit of a gamble with Thompson, and anyway, I think he was. Well, no, I don't know where I don't lay myself open to libel or slander or whatever. So we'll just say that he was not as experienced as probably a production of that scale demanded.
Because he was, of course, the only person did two episodes, but
He
it
did
was probably
too,
just
but
in terms of scheduling, and he was available probably to do the two.
yeah, well, I think that Hanley was involved, and so he probably had choice over the director, and when we saw we were having some challenges, other views prevailed.
Yes. May I ask you? I saw one of the other episodes, as I mentioned, and I saw Ross McLean's name on
That's
it,
right.
the producer. So this is the famous Ross McLean, I
The
assume.
famous Ross McLean. Yeah, I mean, what happened was that Dick and I started, we were both working for the CBC, and for 4 years, there were just the two of us, and we were sort of building a company. When we got bought by Torstar, they had huge ambitions, and I suppose we had a huge ambitions. And there was all kinds of people sort of came after Dick wanting to join the company. And so Dick hired Ross McLean, who'd been one of his rivals at the CBC. He hired Jim Hanley, who'd worked at TV Ontario, the educational network. And people would come to me and say, "Are you worried that these people are, going to be number two in the company?" And I said, "Look, I haven't got time for all of that crap. My name's in the title. It's Nielsen Ferns, so I trust Dick. And while these people may get a lot of his time, I'm busy trying to build an industry, because I was spending half my time working for the producers associations. So it was yeah, there's some strange names come out of those credits. You're right. And again, Ross McLean had no drama experience at all, so but neither did Dick or I when we started. So it was the blind leading the blind, I suppose. But anyway, we survived and managed to thrive. So or at least survive a whole career in the industry. And that's where we're at.
You might be interested to know that 20 years after this, I went to Dick and proposed a feature doc called Music versus the Man, which was about the relationship between musicians, bands, singers, etc., and the authorities. And he got very excited about this and tried to make it with me for about a year, I guess. It never happened. I've gone through 4 other producers. Since then, it has still not been made. Although 2 years ago, I wrote it as a book, and it's released, and it's out as a book. And I on Amazon and everything. And I'm now working with yet another producer, Larry Weinstein, who you
Oh,
probably
Larry is terrific. Larry is a terrific producer.
sure is.
Yeah, he's one of my favorite producers in Canada. He's terrific. If Larry gets behind you, you'll end up with a wonderful, wonderful production.
He's very good.
Yeah,
Yes.
but I mean, what Peter talks about is what our life was like at the time. We were always the underdogs, the independent producers. And I look in my career, you probably develop 10 projects, of which one actually happens. So 9 of your babies die. So it's a pretty cruel business. But you have to keep trying and keep trying. And so sometimes, it wasn't your own babies that got made. It was someone, would come with a really good idea, and some of the money attached in Britain or Australia or France, and you'd come aboard their production. And when co-production works is best is when there's real trust between the partners, and you actually, share your views of the production and share in making it a reality.
The only thing I would say to that, Pat, is that the film business is terrible, but the book business is worse.
Well, I've just been writing my memoirs and a history of independent production in Canada. So it certainly moves slowly. And anyway, I'm having to learn patience in my old age.
I wrote a memoir a few years ago. Here it is here.
Oh, got it. Yeah.
Adventures in filmmaking. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
But I do have now a great publisher in Canada. If you have an interest, we could talk about that if you care.
Oh,
But
good.
One thing I wanted to ask you, Peter.
yes,
The climax of the episode with the Plymouth is being bombarded by the mortar fire, and Steed is trying to get the hat palm print off with the hammer and chisel, which I think is a very good example of all three of them working together. And we pointed out before that previously they've been separated, or it's one of them felt like a spare wheel. But I think in that particular scene, they all kind of work together really well as a trio. So you've got lots of fire effects around the principal actors. Was that quite a tricky thing to do? Lots of elements to it.
sure. And as Pat has said about the industry in those days, a lot of people were getting started, and certainly that would include special effects people and stuntmen. And so, if your costume designer is green, well, that's not going to kill anyone. But if your special effects man doesn't know what they're doing, it can be rather dangerous, as we've had rather recent examples of in the States. So I remember that was the same day I mentioned, where we were shooting in that valley, and there were the mortars and all that going on. And I don't know, to be honest with you, how much reality any of that has to the realities of secret agents fighting the Stasi or the KGB in the 1970s, but it was fun to do. And obviously you enjoyed it, and hopefully other people in the audience did.
I think there's a great sense of jeopardy between them. You see the flames licking very close to Patrick McNee, and it is quite, I think, a sequence. Alan Bryce was the special effects man on the episode, and he went on to do Empire Strikes Back, Alien. Quite a had a good safe pair of hands. And also from a stunt point of view, Drain McLean and Valentino Missetti were the stunt guys on this one. Do you remember either of those two?
Absolutely. Dwayne McLean was the best stuntman in Canada in the 70s, 80s, 90s. And he's still around.
He's still stunting as well. Still.
No, he's not working that I know of, but he's still with us. And I'm sure some of the people on that shoot are not, but Dwayne is. And if he broke any bones over his career, they've mended. So, yes, great guy. I tried to make a movie with him called Stuntman that I wrote with another writer. And it's like, it's as Pat pointed out. You write 10, one of them gets made. Well, Stuntman was one of the 9, but it was rather similar to the recent release, The Fall Guy, that you know.
My son worked on Fall Guy in Australia. Yeah.
Right.
Anyway, yeah, I think what the point really is that, as I said at the beginning of this conversation, that we didn't think any of the writers that were writing for television at the time were particularly good. And the problem was there was so little work that people didn't get a chance to write, get experience, make mistakes. And I think that when the tax shelter regime came in, there was huge number of very bad films made in Canada, and people say, "Oh, isn't Tax Shelter terrible?" And I would always say, well, the other side of the coin is it gave a lot of people work, and if you actually practice your art, you actually, acquire some expertise, and that's really, what has happened is now, we have an industry that's as good as anyone in the world in terms of technical capacity, and whether it's special effects or costumes or set design or whatever, we can compete with anyone. But in those early days 50 years ago, we were still building an industry, and you worked with what you had, and people like Dwayne emerged who were really at the top of their craft, but sometimes you weren't really sure who you would be getting in a particular role, and it was a struggle.
Pat, I would go a little further than that and say, I think the tax shelter era is improperly maligned. I made a film in 2003, I think, a feature called Popcorn with Maple Syrup.
Mm-hmm.
In Canada from A to Z. And we did a story in it on the tax shelter era. And there were a lot of good films made in that. And there were there was a lot of junk. But it, if you look at some of the films that Trubinsky made, that Lantos, etc., there were some pretty stylish films that compare, today and for the last 20 years, this era of making $500,000 films. It's sure there've been a few hits, but there were a few hits back then too.
Yeah.
I
No, I agree with you, Peter. It was maligned, but good things happened there. Yeah.
I did want to ask you, Pat, whether Albert Fennell and Brian Clemens, you had anything to do with them at any point? Because I take it they weren't in when you were shooting.
Yeah, yeah. We, I mean, one of the people we hired early on in Nielsen Ferns was a guy called Hugh Harlow, who you will see there as the line producer or production manager. And we also hired another Brit called Michael Peacock. And the two of them really had a lot more experience in drama production than Dick and I had. So we leaned on them to really, develop things. Dick was more involved in this production than I was. So he had dealings with Albert Fennell and with Brian. I mean, I was kind of in and out. As I say, I was spending a lot of time lobbying for the independent producers, but when we started to see there were some problems in the production, I sort of came in at that point. But it was, yeah, it was. Those were exciting days. Exciting days.
I should mention that there was a coordinating producer for for Albert and Brian, a guy called Ray Austin, who I knew quite well. Do you remember working with Ray Austin at all?
Oh yeah, Ray was very, very competent, and he was really their guy on the ground. I mean, Albert and Brian didn't necessarily come over for that. They were busily working on scripts and things, but Ray was very much our contact, and both Hugh Harlow and Michael Peacock were very close to Ray.
And Peter, was Ray around when you were doing your bits?
Yes, I believe he was, and he was a line producer, production manager, maybe, and certainly was around. But basically, the show was sort of so complicated and so difficult to control
Fragmented in a way, yeah.
by then that they just gave me, told me and my unit what they needed, and off I went and shot it for them. So that was pretty much, Ray was mainly looking after the main unit.
Mhm.
And I guess, was this one the last to be shot as well as the last?
This
broadcast?
might have been the very last one. In terms of its broadcast order, I think Forward Base went out last in some territories, but I think this was probably could very well have been the last one in production, yeah.
I thought that that was not my recollection, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, I'm not entirely. I mean, in some territories, I think Emily went out as the last one, but of course, doesn't mean they were shot that way. So maybe it was
I
a bit
kind of
chaotic.
thought Forward Base was the first, and Emily was anyway. And I thought the Fournier one was the last one we shot, but I may be wrong. I may be wrong.
Certainly,
Yeah.
Pat, I think we have to hand it to Phil. He is the expert on this subject.
Yes.
2020.
Yes, he knows a lot more about the new Avengers than I do, so you're
But-
right. We will defer to your expertise.
Well, the Canadian episodes are really fascinating because most people don't tend to really focus. They tend to get a bit lost in some of the other Avengers stories and eras. And when you rewatch them, there's some good stuff. Dennis Spooner, who did a lot of the Avengers writing, this is one of his scripts. His daughter Elaine sometimes joins my events, so she's great. So there's a lot of good stuff to be had, I think, in the Canadian episodes. Where do you think this one do you think this one is one of the more strongest of the four? Where do you kind of sort of place it in terms of its in the four you did?
Yeah, I think it's up there. And I mean, it had a good cast. Well, I must say, looking at it again, the Toronto police don't come out of this too well. They're either incompetent or corrupt. Hopefully that's changed, but anyway, but
They, al-
it's,
they also all had long hair sticking out of the back of their heads, which I can assure you was not the case in 1970.
yeah, no.
That was typical of actors in those days. They refused to cut their hair, even
Yeah.
playing a cop.
And
Yeah.
I suppose sort of Canada has been developed so much since the 70s. And one thing you look at these episodes is it's quite sort of sparse in terms of the scenery, but I assume now it's a completely almost unrecognizable these locations.
Okay,
Really.
Toronto is unrecognizable. I watched a couple of an episode of something called Toronto or something. It's a real estate kind of show, but they have all these montages. You wouldn't, just like it's another planet. It's not that, but no, this was the era of what was called Toronto the Good. I mean, I remember coming from England and finding if you went to the liquor store, you had to write a list of what you wanted to buy, and they give it you in a brown paper bag. It was all very Presbyterian and uptight. Montreal was the place to be, but then things switched around in the late 70s and 80s, and Toronto really came into its own, and that was the great period in Toronto, is the 80s and early 90s.
One thing, the four Canadian episodes do have an awful lot of location shooting. I was wondering whether was that due to lack of available studio space, or maybe just lack of studios generally, or
Well, there was not the same, a plethora of studios in those days. There was very little of any scale. So it was not like you had a Pinewood in Canada at that period. Now you do, but yeah. But also, I think there was a wish to kind of show off the country a little bit, because that was part of the production value, that we thought that would have appeal in Britain and the States. And indeed, I mean, this is one of the few series in that era that was seen in the US. And so, we should, compliment ourselves. It could hold its own in that marketplace, even though now it looks a little bit clunkier than a contemporary production.
In answer to your question a minute ago about locations, Phil, I was amused to see that a great deal of the locations were shot in the area of Toronto that I now live in, there, which is the West End, waterfront, Humber Bay. Well, there's in fact a restaurant show called Pickin' Chicken, which Joanna Lumley makes a reference to, sort of a sarcastic reference to that. And when I saw it, it was amazing, because it just sat there all alone on the waterfront, and all those scenes with people zooming around in motorboats and that, also shot there. Well, that area seen there as a pretty much of a wasteland with an almost empty Lakeshore Boulevard and this single restaurant. We now have about 30 giant high-rise condos, and we've got an additional 34,000 people living in exactly this area as of about the last 5 years. So yes, things don't look the same as they did in the new Avengers anymore, in the new Toronto.
It's a great time capsule, these shows, isn't it? I think that's why the Brits like the stuff in the UK, because it shows not, well, as you said, it's the London we see in these shows, the spy world doesn't exist, but it is nevertheless an interesting look at what things what were like. Do either of you have any memories of Patrick McNee, Joanna Lumley, and Gav Hunt that you'd like to recall?
Well,
I mean, I have a fondness for Patrick. He was a real gentleman, and having known his son much better than I knew him, I obviously was quite sad when I heard of Patrick's passing. But no, I obviously followed Joanna Lumley's career, and both as an actress, as a comedian, and now as a television presenter. She's made a real success of her career.
Well, I will just second the interest in Patrick's son, because I worked with Rupert quite a bit in the 70s too. And he now lives down in Palm Springs or somewhere near there.
Yeah.
I'm sort of a Facebook friend of his. I see his drawings and stuff on Facebook, and but I did quite a few episodes of series with him. A show called Behind the Scene, which he produced, which was a dark series, and another one which is better left forgotten, because one of the few shows I never got paid on. So, but it wasn't his fault. It was his boss's fault. I don't know if he got paid, but I didn't. Anyway, Rupert's still kicking down there in California.
And I did do an event for the original Avengers, and Rupert was in the audience, which was very nice that he was interested in this sort of thing. There's two actors an actress in the show I wanted to mention. The lady who plays Miss Daly Jane Mallet.
Mallet, yeah.
And do either of you remember Jane at all, or what if I never?
Yeah, she was a terrific actress in the theater as well. And there's a theater in Toronto that was named in the St. Lawrence Center, I think, wasn't it, called the Jane Mallet Theater. So
Yeah.
she was a classic, yeah, and very a really nice lady, and had a tremendous career. So it was good to capture her in her golden age, as it were.
Another actor in the series in Emily is a guy named Sandy Crawley, who was
Sandy, yeah.
Yes, Sandy was the son of a man named Butch Crawley, who was the absolute doyen of the Canadian film industry, starting way back in the 40s. And by the 70s, he was producing some features and the like. And Sandy's one of his kids, and Sandy's still around. Didn't have much of an acting career, but he went on to do some other things. I think produced.
Yeah, Budge was, when I was first came to the industry and we're trying to identify who were the independent characters, I really felt Budge was he'd take on anyone you liked, and he had a big battle with the National Film Board. He'd done a film called The Loon's Necklace, which won the top prize in Venice, and no one wanted to buy it, but it was the sort of resentment that someone independent had gone and won the top prize and beaten out all these others. So Budge was a great guy, but he wanted to do drama, and he did some very good drama films. But what'll probably be remembered is actually his documentaries. He did the film on Janis Joplin called Janis. He did The Man Who Skied Down Everest, which was a documentary. I mean, that's what he's going to be remembered for, rather than The Loon's Necklace as a short. Or he did some good stuff in Newfoundland, I remember, with Gordon Pinsent and stuff. So but he was a real character, and I knew a couple of his sons who, I'm sure Budge and Judy were good parents to have in one sense, but I think it's the great man syndrome that it's hard to come out from the reputation of your very famous and very buccaneering father. Yeah.
Great story about Budge. The Newfoundland film you mentioned is The Rowdy Man, which
Rowdy Man, that's right. Yeah.
Yes. So that was Phil, that was one of the sort of first real successful Canadian features of the 1970s. So it got a special screening in front of Pierre Trudeau in Ottawa. And things were so screwy in those days that they put the film on, and it showed, and it went on upside down because it had been put on the reels wrong. Pierre said something about, did he have to stand on his head to watch this film? But the classic thing was that Budge had two wives, both at the same time. And there was a receiving line at the beginning before the film. So he introduced his first wife, Judy, who he mentioned, to Pierre Trudeau. And then Pierre Trudeau went down the line a little bit. And he then introduced his second wife. And of course, Pierre was a pretty liberal kind of thinking person himself, but this astounded even him. Budge Crawley was a character.
Yeah.
Do you both remember Leslie Carlson, who plays the elusive
Carlson? Yeah, he had a strong career in television. Yeah.
Still around.
I don't think he's
Right.
still around, unfortunately. I think he died a few years ago.
see.
Would you have worked with Leslie, Peter?
Just on, I knew him well, but the only time we worked together was on the New Avengers. Yeah. But he, like a lot of people that are in that episode, was kind of a part of a fairly small coterie of working actors, working film actors in that era. You know, soon after that, we developed much more experienced and skillful actors like, well, Kenneth Welch, who was in
In the episode you did some of the work on in The Newcomers.
Yes.
Kenny Welch, great
Kenny.
actor.
Yes, great actor. Michael Hogan, his wife Susan Hogan, and then a whole group of those kind of people. Stratford to some degree, but National Theatre School. But just the fact that there was, by the 80s, there was work, and they got work. You know, John Hirsch started us, at CBC to get a drama department together. In the 80s, I was able to make quite a lot of films for CBC and dramas, which doesn't really exist anymore. Well, it doesn't exist.
Did you, Pat, remember Karen Hazard, the casting director? Would you have known her at all?
Yeah, I mean, I there were a lot of really good casting directors in Canada. So she tended to focus on more on the feature film end. And my career then veered much more towards television. And so, I remember working with a number of Diane Pauley did a lot of stuff for me, and Ann Tate, and yeah, there were some, but as Peter was saying, that talent started to find opportunity in that 70s into the early 80s period, and so you got there was creative competition, and there was a lot of very talented people emerged in that period.
Karen Hazard was another rather colorful character and a good casting director. And Diane Pauley, who Pat just mentioned, was Sarah Pauley's mother. And she was a wonderful actress and then later a casting director, mostly at CBC. And Sarah Pauley has made a fascinating film.
About her parents, and we had Sarah in a production I did called Heaven on Earth, which was a Margaret Atwood script, and she was before she did Anne of Avonlea and all of that. So it was, but I think her mum had cast her. She also cast some of my kids as orphans in that production. I thought, that's a judgment on me.
So you're saying, Pat, that you were involved in financing the whole of the second series in some form or the other. I know a lot of series, when they start to get towards the end of the production, some of the money trickles into other episodes that have gone over budget or etc. When it came to shooting the fall in Canada, was the budget what you wanted it to be, or was it kind of tight?
It was what, if it had been what we thought it was, it would have been fine. But what Ruffy had been doing was stealing from Peter to pay Paul, as it were, and so money was not forthcoming. So fortunately, we had a rich parent in the form of Torstar. So we were able to make sure that everyone got paid, but the victims really were Dick Nielsen and myself, because we had to give up our shares. so that Torstar could write off the losses against their huge profits on the newspaper side.
But the budget, but in terms of actual episodic production, that was kind of protected by everything. Well, that wasn't sort of compromised in any way.
No, I mean, things probably cost more than they should have done because, of our relative inexperience, but certainly we were, anxious to do a product that would, be seen on CBS, and we thought this would be a big breakthrough, and indeed it was seen on CBS, but for Dick and I, it was not. It was the beginning of the end with Torstar, and so in '81 we started over again, at the bottom of the pile and worked our way up. And Dick and I were together until '85, and then he was wanting to spend more time writing his own scripts and producing them, and I was doing international co-production, and we tended to make money on the international co-productions and lose a little on the others. So Dick and I had been good friends since 1968, and so we thought it would be best if we went our separate ways. So I bought him out of the company with then Prime Media. I bought him out by assuming the debt of Prime Media, not giving him piles of cash, and he formed a company called Norflix, which is what he ran until his death. But that's where Peter would have been talking to him about the music series, etc. But Peter, I hope that it all works out with Larry Weinstein, because he's one of the finest music producers in the world, and that sounds really good.
I just saw his latest film at Hot Docs, and it's great. But all his films, as you say, they're wonderful.
He's a master, yeah.
And
Yeah,
what? So go on, Pat. Go on.
I was just going to say, Larry was one of a troika of people who had a company called Rhombus, and they did the best arts documentaries in the world. But they came to me when they were just leaving York University, I think the three of them, and their first film was appropriately called Opus One, Number One, and it was about Niamh Fitchman's brother, who was becoming a concert pianist, and they went on to produce the best stuff. And I mean, I was probably the largest arts producer in Canada at the time, but I saw this was the new generation, and they were going to, knock me for six. They were really brilliant people, and then a fourth person joined them, Sheena MacDonald, who was their distributor. And Sheena and I, over the years, we were often found ourselves at the same festivals, and eventually, when I was running Banff, Sheena and I had a sort of we'd go and schmooze a crowd, and I'd pitch Rhombus and she'd pitch Banff, and we found this kind of wearing different hats was very effective. But she went on to be the COO at the Canadian Film Centre, which Norman Jewison founded, and she's now retired. But she was a really good person putting co-production together, because arts co-productions tend to involve a lot of art, a lot of countries, and they did a fantastic job.
Pat, to ask you, did you ever have any idea back then that your sugar daddy, Torstar, would ever end up in the way it is today? Just shocking that the newspaper industry has collapsed, and most especially Torstar.
Yeah, I never would have thought it. But what was interesting at the time, just before they acquired us, they bought Harlequin Enterprises, which was the kind of romance novel king of the world, and they made a lot of money out of that, and but eventually they, as they fell on hard times, they sold off Harlequin, and now they're really struggling. But I still have some dealings with them because people keep coming out of the woodwork, just like you, Philip, saying, "Do you remember the new Avengers?" They want to see things that have lasted, have got a legacy, but I no longer have any rights in them. So I'm constantly referring them to Torstar, who really have no corporate history and no memory of things. They can't even find where the masters are. So it's kind of sad that there's a whole part of my career was lost there. And anyway, but so be it. So be it. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you very briefly, both of you, why you wanted to go into film business, TV production in the first place. Was there the catalyst that made you want to go into this career?
Well, I guess at high school, I was always doing school plays, which were of a very high order. In fact, we sometimes, the Guardian or the Telegraph would come and review our school play. And I remember once the English master who directed Volpone wrote to the Telegraph to complain because we were compared slightly unfavorably to a Donald Wolfett production in the West End. And, he had to remind them that these were schoolboys. And, but so I was always interested in performing, and I took a gap year between high school and going to Cambridge, where I came back to my native land, Canada. I became a school teacher for a year. I learned to be a folk singer, and the school I was at actually was where Ian Tyson had gone to school. And I later worked with Sylvia Tyson, which was a joy. And it was also the school that Atom Egoyan went to. And so when Atom, was coming to Toronto to make his fortune, the headmaster said, "Go and see Pat Ferns." And so Atom came with his rucksack with all his home movies in it, and I looked at them all. And I wrote his very first application to the Canada Council. And when he won in Cannes for Exotica, I sent him a congratulatory note, and he just sent back a message that said, "You were the first." And so I've got a real affection for Atom. Yeah, so I was always interested. I thought I was intrigued to see some of the films that were being done in that era by the National Film Board. There was a Don Owen film called Never Wave Goodbye or Don't Wave Goodbye. And so I was applying to the National Film Board, and they claimed to be interested in me. But they never offered me a job. So I wrote to my godmother, who was in Toronto, and said, "Send me the address of the CBC." She wrote back and said, "There's only one person I know at the CBC. His name is Dick Nielsen. Why don't you write to him?" So Dick, he liked my handwriting, and he remembers letters my father had written to the Toronto Globe and Mail. And on those two bases, he gave me a phone call. We talked for 20 minutes, and suddenly I had a job as his head of research. So that was, and the rest, I suppose, is history. Is that Dick and I really got on well. I became a producer under him at the CBC, and then we left the CBC together to form this independent production company, Nielsen Ferns. So yeah, he was my mentor, and I have a huge affection for him. Yeah, alas, he's no longer with us.
And Peter, what took you to get into the film business?
Stock answer to that question is I couldn't play the guitar and I couldn't paint, so I became a filmmaker. But since, by the way, I do a lot of painting And I also played guitar until this accident with my voice. But it's been I too started in live theater. I worked for 3 years in summer stock theater in the US and Canada. And but I rapidly, once I discovered film and how much more fun film is than live theater, I got into that at university, and we made some crazy films and became notorious for the outrageous things we did in our underground films. We were even on the national news with our after our films had been confiscated by the Toronto Morality Squad. And, so, and since then, I've never had a real job. Only one day in my life. Worked for Canada Packers, which is a meat packing plant. One day. From that, I've been able to do this, and without there's films I wish I'd made. There's things I wish I'd done, but in general, I've had the chance to make 180 plus films in my life. Had this terrible accident while filmmaking about 10 years ago, 8 years ago. It was on a volcano, and I ingested sulfuric acid from sulfur dioxide gas, and that destroyed my voice, and so that's why I talk like this, unfortunately. I had a big operation on it about 3 weeks ago, which was supposed to fix it, but so far hasn't. But in any case, it's a little difficult these days. I say action, nobody moves. But that's why I've taken up writing in a big way. I've written 5 books, and I'll show you my latest. This is my latest book. It's called Out There, the Batshit.
Antics of the World Great Explorers. Yeah, great title.
Yeah.
Or a great subtitle.
Yes. And just yesterday, it was announced that I won honorable mention in a book prize called the Williams Award, I think it is. So that's going to be presented next month. But so that's what I've been doing, and I'm actually working as a kind of a mentor to 2 young film women who are filmmakers. They're mostly comics. They've written a feature script, which I was hired by an organization to come act as a mentor. So still keep my hand in a little bit in the biz.
So you both have very prolific careers and very varied careers. Peter, you've won awards for your filmmaking. Pat, you won the Order of Canada for your contribution to the Canadian industry. Do you both have proudest projects or moments from those from your career that maybe some of what I've mentioned?
Well, I guess I'm having just completed this professional memoir and history of independent production. I guess I do feel that I was surprised to get the recognition of the Order of Canada, but they basically, the citation was that I helped to build the independent industry. I made the Banff Television Festival a world-class event, and the body of work I did was celebrated, Canadian art and talent. So if those are the 3 things I'm remembered for, then I'm a happy man. As I say at the end of my memoir, the great thing about this industry is I've never been bored. I don't know what boredom is.
Peter?
I'm honored to be on your show, Phil, with someone like Pat Fern, who has had such an illustrious career and made so many good films, and you know, of course, his involvement in the television festival as well. I've had a lot of fun traveling the world. I making films all over the world. I've been to all continents and made films in 40 or 50 countries. And one of my favorites was a series called African Skies, which I did with Robert Michener and Catherine Bach, and co-production like Pat's films, Germany, U.S., Canada, and England. No, I don't think England was, but Germany was, and South Africa. That's what fourth one was. And and my other series, Angry Planet. But certainly, you know, my interest was always getting out there in the trenches and being, you know, many of them not that one, but many I shot myself. So I'm a, you know, cinematographer as well, and I just like doing it. It was fun. It was great, and you know, working with some fun people. Did a show with Mickey Rooney. I did Treasure Island with Jack Palance, etc. And so had some fun making films with some talent. It was fun to
May I briefly ask you, Peter, what Jack Palance was like?
most mercurial person I've ever met. Moody is not quite the word for it, because Moody suggests that he was always grumpy. He was not. But moody in the sense that he would shift from one mood to another very rapidly. He was one of the last films he ever did. I think the second last was my film with him. You know, we don't have time to go into the details, but he would change gears from being a terrific guy to work with to being very grumpy, to put a simple word on it. But, you know, it was a difficult part. We were on a rolling pirate ship, big 125-foot ship. He was wearing a wooden leg. He had a parrot on his shoulder. And that was biting his ear half the time, you know. But he was a trooper. It was fun to work with him. And I mean, to work with the guy who had won an Oscar for Shane, and then had done one-arm push-ups on the Oscars with Billy Crystal. I mean, what a pleasure. And so it was fun.
My last question on the Avengers, Pat, when the show was pitched to you, was it designed to be series 3, series 4, and you would have like a long-term commitment to it? Were there other ideas floating about for episodes, something like that?
It was very much that the first series was completed. They needed partners on the second, and so we saw this as being an entree into US television. So we were looking forward to a third or fourth and whatever episode, and then we found we were dealing with a fraudster, so that abruptly ended. So, I mean, a lot of my career, I was co-producing with Europe, but it was through that I was able to crack the US market. So, you know, we produced the first programs from Canada on Masterpiece Theatre on PBS. I did the first US network series, miniseries, And so, we did a lot of work with ABC, NBC, CBS, and so and then subsequently HBO and on, because that's the way the world turned. So, my career has gone through that period where the public broadcasters were the strong players, and then commercial broadcasters came in, and then the specialties came along and ate the lunch of the legacy broadcasters, and now we see the streamers eating the lunch of the specialties. So we're in a world that's now dominated by Microsoft and Google and Meta and various other technology companies, and I think the world is again changing in a way that I'm not particularly happy about, but that's the way of the world.
There was dramatic changes, and I was talking to somebody who's very much had wrote a lot for television, and how you don't get writers don't get the repeat money because it's all streaming, and it's smaller contracts, so you're not with a whole show. So yes, it is changing well dramatically. I know that Brian Clemens was thinking about doing some more Canadian episodes. He had an idea for Gareth Hunt's character Gambit to go off Niagara Falls in a barrel, and some sort of so involving some more of the sort of landmarks of Canada. Do you think they would have perhaps gone perhaps in that direction and celebrating the more obvious locations that Canada had to offer?
Yeah, I'm not sure what they would have done, but I suspect that Brian's heart was in series television and action and drama, and that's where I think he would have found his greatest satisfaction.
And my final question, before I let you guys go, of course, we've covered how the Canadian industry has moved on dramatically from the 70s. Is there still work to be done in its equality? Because I was talking to somebody who worked a lot in Canada, and he was saying that a lot of American productions are in Canada, but at doubling for American locations, and it's obviously because it's cheaper to make television over there. Is there still a way to go to be up there with, say, the UK and America?
Well, I think that we produce things that were on the BBC or ITV that got the highest ratings of the season, so that I don't think there's any question that Canada can produce to the same quality as the United States or the UK. And we have a very professional industry now. I think that the sadness is that Canadian voices and Canadian storytellers are being sidelined a bit now, because everything is now moving in the direction of the streamers, and there's harder and harder to find the opportunity for Canadian stories to tell, Canadian storytellers to make their own stories. And I think it's interesting to see that I remember the license renewal hearings for the CBC way back in the late 60s and early 70s, where we were clamoring to get a chance to be heard. And some of those same arguments are now being made again. So that the last chapter in my book is called Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. And that's what it is everything seems different, but we're still, at times feel we're back at the beginning.
Well, I will just comment about your question to say that there's even a bigger issue than whether Canadian television can compete. And that is the question of whether the golden age of television, and certainly of movie theaters, is behind us or is about to be behind us. The Memorial Day weekend that just ended in the States, worst Memorial Day theatrical showing ever. And, you know, the issue is that people just aren't going to the movie theaters anymore. And there's such competition with free entertainment on TikTok, on YouTube, and on Instagram that people, especially young people, but all people really, spend so much of their time getting unmonetized, but often very funny or well done, amusing content on these, in this short form video programming that they get virtually for free or sometimes with some advertising.
And
So,
I think what we've always forgotten in our industry, whether it's television or films, is that the gaming industry is way bigger than us. And that's where the money is, and that's where the audience is spending its time.
Well, I think that's probably a lovely place to end it, unless either of you want to add anything before we go.
no, thank you, Philip. That's great. Thanks for your interest in having us on.
Great.
Well, thank you very much, guys. It's been a really interesting chat, and I think we were worried what we were going to talk about, weren't we? And I think we've come up with quite a nice, a fascinating evening, really. So thanks so much indeed for spending your time talking to me.
Okay, thanks, Philip.
Okay. Well, enjoy your week and take care, guys.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye, Pat. Bye, Peter. Well, thanks very much, guys, for watching that event. You might have already have copies of this one, but I just wanted to mention, because Roy was very kind enough to send me a copy of the Avengers trivia, the Avengers official quiz book. Just say if you haven't got it, it is available from protomedia.co.uk. That's QUOIT, and then media.co.uk. It's a really good book. It covers the new Avengers as well as the original Avengers. So if you haven't got it, I'd recommend picking up a copy of that one there. It's a really good book by Roy Bettridge, and I'd recommend it. Well, thanks everybody for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your week. Bye.